Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel on community IDs. My name is Oliver Torres. I use he, him, él pronouns, and I am a senior outreach paralegal at the Southern Poverty Law Center based out of Miami. And I work in the Immigrant Justice Department. And I have been doing this for about 4 years. And I have the honor of presenting today along a dear partner and friend, Tomas Kennedy, who can introduce himself in a second, and Commissioner Dale Honas, one of our champion legislators, will be joining us for part of the presentation. Unfortunately, he is experiencing an emergency, so he will not be able to be as involved today as we had hoped, but we're still gonna have a great presentation with so much information. And Tomas, can you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you, with Commissioner Holness, and everybody else that's taking part of this event, and of course all the attendees that are watching. But yeah, my name is Tomas Kennedy. I'm a community organizer, immigration advocate. I've been involved with a number of different organizations. I used to work for the Florida Immigrant Coalition. I worked for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and most recently I was the national campaign manager for United We Dream, which is a national immigrant rights organization with a youth orientation. And right now, yeah, I'm just sort of like a free agent, working with various groups, helping them out with various immigration-based campaigns, and of course, still working on this community ID initiative as we move into the implementation portion of the campaign, and also trying to expand it even beyond Miami-Dade and Broward into other counties and municipalities. So we're still fighting this fight.
Looking forward to continue fighting with you, Tomas. It's a great cause and a lot of fun. And so today, the key questions we will be exploring. What is a community ID? Why is it critical for all of our communities? And how do we win locally to create community IDs? Here is a sample of the Faith Action ID card. We'll be talking about them a lot today, and it is one of the many community IDs that exist, and the community ID that we have chosen to push and implement in Florida. And so our first section today, what are community IDs? There are 3 parts to this. It's communities that would benefit the most, who needs the IDs, why fight for them, its uses and limitations, why do people really need them, and what can people not do with them? And then again, talking about the Faith Action ID Network, the coalition with which we have been partnering. So communities that would most benefit. Tomas, can you share with us a little bit about some of the communities that would most benefit from the IDs?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, a lot of people think about these IDs as solely benefiting, like the undocumented population. And while of course they do, and, as an immigrant rights advocate and an immigrant myself, I mean, that has been obviously, something that has really attracted me to this campaign. I was actually pretty ignorant about like its broad use, the broad use of these sort of community IDs until I really started getting in the weeds of it all. And they benefit a lot of people, actually. The houseless population, right? People that are unfortunately experiencing houselessness, the elderly, or seniors, returning citizens, right? People with former felony convictions that are exiting the carceral state, the trans population, youth, especially youth that are in the foster care system, right? And the reason why the populations are so broad is because, when you think about, a state ID, right, that complies with what's called the Real ID Act, right, something that was passed after 9/11, making it more difficult for people to get a federal or state issue ID, right, with a social security number. There's actually a lot of people that were impacted by that, right? It's not just the undocumented population. All the populations that I mentioned are populations that have difficulty accessing, again, a social security number, the strict documentation requirements that are required to get a state ID. So the benefits are broad, and there are a lot of people in our community that are living, what we call the margins, right? That don't have access to a form of identification, and it's something that we need to rectify immediately.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tomas. And as you can see here, these identities all exist in intersection with each other, right? You can be a trans person who is also experiencing homelessness, who is also an undocumented immigrant. You'll need an ID. You could be a youth who is just in juvenile detention, returning to the community and need an ID, right? These communities all exist in conversation while intersecting with one another. And as Tomas mentioned, there are uses and limitations, right? Tomas, can you share with us some of the uses and I can discuss the limitations?
Yeah, sure. So, I mentioned briefly the Real ID Act, right? So again, I just want to give a little background as to why this is necessary. Post 9/11, there was a law passed in 2005, the Real ID Act, that put strict requirements into, accessing a federal or state ID. And that's why these community or municipal IDs are necessary, unfortunately. And they can be used for a variety of purposes. I used to be undocumented. I'm no longer undocumented. But when I was little, growing up in the Miami-Dade public school system, my mom, for example, couldn't pick me up from school because she didn't have an ID. So they wouldn't release me to her because she couldn't prove that she was, my mother, my guardian in the eyes of the U.S. government or, the county school board. So that is one use. Another one is to have an ID, obviously, to present to law enforcement in whether you want to report, a crime or call the police, whatever it is. A lot of people in the undocumented community are intimidated to call the police. Another one is just if you get stopped, right? Let's say you run a stoplight or are just racially profiled, as happens. Not having an ID can really increase the consequences of that police interaction. It can also be used for healthcare purposes, right? One of the things that made this program so appealing to commissioners, in the current context is, of course, there were state residency restrictions on vaccination, right? For COVID-19. And even after those state residency restrictions were lifted, you still have to show proof of age in a lot of places or show an ID at all to get the vaccine. So this lack of ID, the fact that 1 out of every 10 Miami-Dade residents, for example, don't have an ID, it was really, and it still is, hindering our ability to vaccinate the full population. There's also uses for finance purposes. You can use it at a local credit union to open up a bank account, right? So the uses are actually very broad and really benefit these communities.
Thanks, Tomas. It's also important to note the limitations, right? As Tomas mentioned, this is not a federal Real ID. What does that mean? You can't use it for voting. You can't use it for flights. You can't just substitute this for federal purposes. This is very much a community ID for community purposes. It's also not a municipal ID. It is not sponsored by the county or by any local government. Those models exist in places like New York City and Chicago. We have the community ID model that is run through a third-party agency and is much more limited in its use. But still provides the necessary benefits for our communities. We will modify the program for 1 second right now because Commissioner Dale Holness was able to join. And so Commissioner Holness, Can you share with us just a little bit about your motivation for the IDs and why you advocated? I understand you have an emergency right now.
Yes, I am actually in the emergency room with my mom. You might hear the sound going off. My daughter and my dad will leave me in a few minutes. Uh, but I'll go ahead and join you. Now, I'll turn on the video. I don't know if you can see me or I'm using my phone, so it's a little cumbersome. Eh? I'll let the video stay.
We have a slide on. So if you can just share with us, I'm so sorry to hear about your mother. Thank you so much for making the time despite this crisis.
Okay.
And any information you can share is more than enough and clearly welcomed. Thank you.
So let me thank you for having me, and I'm grateful of the work that we're doing, the collaborative nature of our effort to engage the community, the law enforcement, and other elected officials to do what's right and what's in the best interest of our community. Putting this ID in place is going to help empower people to be able to provide a better life for themselves, to take care of their children, and to maintain good health. It is essential that we did this. So a big part of what I did was reach out to Sheriff Tony to get him on board. He did a letter of support for us, which was a huge deal for some of my county commissioners who might have been somewhat doubtful as to why we should do this. He recommended that it would be helpful to law enforcement and could save them time and help them in their investigative work, because now someone has some sort of identification, would probably more than likely to talk to them about issues. Getting the other Black elected officials, I'm chair of the broad Black elected officials, so I was able to reach out to some of them and direct Tomas and others to reach out to them, and they embraced what we're doing and joined within our efforts. The community partners are essential. When you have the Urban League, Hispanic Unity, ACLU, the agencies that help our people who are oftentimes in crisis and in need of help. Legal aid was a huge addition for us because they have the legal expertise to help guide the process through. So having them on board really brought the community together to ensure that we're doing God's work, so to speak, to help our fellow human beings get a life somewhat that is a little better than where they are now. Certainly, we need to do a lot more than this. We need to have full immigration reform. The Congressional Budget Office points to the fact that if we were to do this, we would reduce our federal deficit, would grow our economy. One source says we could grow our economy by $1.3 trillion if we had comprehensive immigration reform. That's a path that we need to go down to. You've heard of the labor shortages that are occurring in some areas now. For a country, we need to do this so that we can continue our economic growth and our economic output that will benefit every single American, no matter where they were born, no matter their ethnicity, the color of their skin. I'm grateful to be a part of this effort to bring these ID to our community, and we'll continue to support it. I just left today our citizenship drive effort in Lauderdale Hill Mall, working with Florida Immigrant Coalition to get that done, to be here with my mother. And you know, God bless my mother. She's done a heck of a job raising me and helping to get me to where I am.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for your comments, for your invaluable help, and for taking the time in the midst of a crisis to share your wisdom with us. I wish all the best to you and your mother today, and we will continue to modify the presentation and elevate everything that you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Going back to where we were. Thank you all for your patience. Appreciate it. So Faith Action ID Network. It's a great network that exists, as you can see, in many parts around the US, in several states, in several communities. When we were examining different models, there's the municipal ID model, right, that we discussed that we didn't go with. It's a different model. The enhanced library card, again, a different model. This is the community ID card. It is grounded in community, as its name states. There are benefits because there's a national coalition that already exists. This has been happening for years around the US, and folks have best practices they can share to help ensure that our communities are receiving the maximum benefits from this great program. And there's a built-in support system, and we already have allies in Alachua County and in West Palm who have been implementing this program through the Faith Action ID Network for several years. Need to give credit to the amazing advocates in Alachua/Gainesville who did some of this initial research a few years ago and closely examined some of our Florida laws. I'll use this time to encourage you all to check out the webinar series that came out last year through the same program. There's an entire video dedicated to the community ID advocacy that occurred in Gainesville, Florida. Again, the first in our state to implement this program, that covers some of the public record request laws and other state laws that kind of limit what we can do because of requirements with federal enforcement agencies. So the Faith Action ID Network works for Florida laws. It works for us in Florida. And the community orientation, these IDs can only happen if a lot of people come together. Community power is built and this program is executed. And so the program works through a drive model. Once or twice a month, at a church, at a library, a bunch of volunteers show up and a bunch of folks in need of IDs also show up. They understand the uses and limitations and sign up for an ID and get it in the mail about a week and a half later. During those drives, all of our coalition partners have a presence there. I'll once again use the example. Let's think of an undocumented person who is also trans. Maybe they've been working with the Florida Immigrant Coalition as an advocate for immigrant rights, but weren't aware that there are other agencies that could help this person with the transition. And so the purpose of these drives is to let folks know of all the benefits that exist in our community. And so through that drive, we can connect that person to some of our coalition partners that could potentially help with the transition process, such as TransSocial or SAVE here in Miami-Dade. So our next section, identifying the need. What's key here is the importance of centering impacted communities. So we're gonna look at this in 3 different sections: community voices, Miami-Dade history. Well, the Broward need, unfortunately, Commissioner Holness can't share, but there was a need in Broward as well. So community voices. What I will say, working in policy and working with lawyers, working with some folks who love reading theory, there's often a disconnect behind theory and the needs of directly impacted individuals. Those who actually need the IDs, who will benefit from the IDs, right? And so when considering local policy fights, which one should we prioritize and why? In theory, a cite and release policy, for example, which we'll talk about a little more later, might bring a lot of benefits to the community from just reading folks, and I think it'll bring more benefits to the community than community IDs. But when engaging directly impacted folks, members of organizations like We Count, United We Dream, the Miami Workers Center, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, there's a long history of folks screaming for these IDs. They have identified that they need IDs to be able to pick up their kids from school, to be able to interact with police, to be able to go to the hospital. It is a huge need. And so as a coalition, we decided This is the fight we must prioritize in this moment in history. And as we said, this fight has been occurring across the state. It's not just one little community in Florida that identified this need. It's a lot, ranging from North Florida, Central Florida, all the way to Key West right now, where a fight is starting. Tomas, can you share with us a bit of the history in Miami-Dade?
Yeah, sure. So, the Community ID initiative has been in place as a campaign for a long time, since almost like the early 2010s, right? So in 2015, the Miami-Dade County Commission actually passed a resolution unanimously sponsoring the idea of not exactly a community ID. They sponsored the idea of a municipal ID. And the semantics here are important because they wanted the ID to go through the actual county, right? Like Miami-Dade County would administer the ID program, created, be responsible for public record keeping. And what we are doing is we're actually doing it with a community organization in partnership with the county, right? So backtracking a little bit, in 2015, the Miami-Dade County Commission votes to unanimously support this idea. It was being sponsored by Commissioner Zapata, who was a Republican actually, back in those times. And a feasibility study was commissioned to basically assess the fiscal impact of a program like this. So this feasibility study stalled the campaign for years. And it wasn't completed, I believe, up until 2019. So it took about almost 4 years to complete this study. And it was completed, I believe, right at the end of the Carlos Gimenez mayoral administration or right afterwards. And of course, Carlos Gimenez, who's now a member of Congress from the Republican Party, just stalled and obstructed this efforts to enact a municipal ID program all throughout his mayoral tenure. So once Commissioner Zapata left the commission, Daniela Levin Cava, the current mayor of Miami-Dade County and a former commissioner, picked up that legislation and tried to push it through. But there was really no appetite. And again, the Mayor Gimenez was not a huge supporter, to say the least, of this initiative. And it just sort of remained stalled, with the feasibility study. There were efforts to pass this in 2019. It failed in 2020 because of COVID. The commission didn't prioritize it. And then when Levin Cava was elected mayor, the legislation was transferred over to Commissioner Eileen Higgins, who is the current sponsor of the IDs. And once the COVID-19 situation had stabilized a little bit and the vaccination program was being rolled out, a number of us went back to commissioners, both in Miami-Dade and Broward, and basically made the case that it would be a good time to revisit, a community ID program because of the need to get our community vaccinated and the restrictions and hindrances that I mentioned previously in terms of getting people without ID vaccinated, right? I mean, you remember, you have to show proof of age. A lot of these vaccination sites require IDs. And because of what, politicians, the commissioners were calling, and the governor, the political class really was calling vaccine tourism, right? People from other countries coming to Florida and other places in the United States to get vaccinated. There were state residency restrictions that were put in place to prevent that from happening. But what ended up, that ended up affecting our most vulnerable communities, right? People who didn't have access to IDs or documentation to show Florida state residency. And obviously people who tend to work as essential workers, right? Frontline workers, the hospitality industry, farm workers, people who are actually, they can't quarantine, they can't work through Zoom and are exposed to people every day, right? So it was very, very counterproductive, in my opinion, both a humane lens, but also in just like a sheer health public policy. It was really, really stupid what we did in Florida. And the fact that we didn't have a backup plan to get people a form of documentation to get vaccinated really shows how short-sighted it was that we hadn't implemented a program like this in the first place. And the fact that in a place like Miami-Dade, we did have, the situation was so bad that 1 out of every 10th resident did not have an ID. And luckily we were able to connect with folks like Commissioner Dale Holness, with folks like Commissioner Eileen Higgins, to really push these initiatives through and convince the other commissioners who once, and I don't want to denigrate or diminish their support, but once they saw the scale of the public crisis engulfing not just the nation, but the world, and how short-sighted it was to not have something like this in place in the first place, we were able to get it through, right? And like I said, we're still in the implementation process. So this story has not ended yet, right? But we are farther along than we've ever been. And we are very, very close to getting these IDs into people's hands now that they've been approved by both county commissions, both Miami-Dade and Broward. And I'll pass it over back to you, Oliver.
Thanks so much, Tomas. And thanks for also discussing the need in Broward County. Again, we're sending warm wishes to Commissioner Holness, who is unfortunately in the emergency room with his mother. But also want to give a shout out to Broward Legal Aid, who will be housing the IDs, hopefully by this fall when the program is implemented. Next section, coalition building. This is critical. As you can see, coalition building, these are the puzzle pieces, right? We need everyone to come together to complete the picture, to get it done. So we're going to discuss engaging various sectors and highlighting the value of community leaders. Engaging various sectors. We talked about impacted communities and the intersections already. There are so many identities that would deeply benefit from IDs. It is our duty as advocates to center them all, right? To give them a space, to give them a voice, a mic, to advocate for themselves in alignment with others. It can also be strategic. Different folks have different angles. Different elected officials, different commissioners have different motivations. So it's on us as advocates to identify what appeals to each commissioner, what appeals to each person in power, and how do we identify the most powerful messenger to deliver an appealing message to ultimately get that vote, to ultimately win. In Miami-Dade, I'm very proud of the incredible coalition that came together and made this fight successful after so many iterations of hardships. So in the spirit of the coalition, it is my duty to shout out people acting for a community together, PACT, United We Dream, Miami Homes for All, Catalyst Miami, the Florida Health Justice Project, Save Dade, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, FLIC, the Miami Workers Center, We Count, Miami Bridge, American Friends Service Committee, SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, Transsocial, the Community Justice Project, Struggle for Miami's Affordable and Sustainable Housing, or SMASH, the Miami Freedom Project, ACLU of Florida, PS 305, and so many other partners who help behind the scenes. Thank you all so much for coming together and advocating for so many identities. And Tomas, can you talk to us about the power of working alongside a local leader like Josie?
I was on mute. Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the first thing I gotta say is that, yeah, you gotta be strategic, like Oliver said, right? Like these IDs benefit a lot of populations. And while all are ultimately centered and have to be centered in a campaign like this, you can sort of like pick and choose depending on which commissioner or which strategic point of the campaign you're in to highlight in terms of getting support, right? So we knew that, for example, one commissioner in Miami-Dade was really interested in child welfare, right? So we really highlighted the fact that it's going to help children in foster care, right? And we Oliver and I are just to be quite frank, part of organizations that tend to really throw down in like hot political fights, right? And they tend to litigate, they tend to hold politicians accountable. They're political advocacy organizations in a lot of regards, right? So those organizations have their role to play in a campaign like this, but they might not necessarily be the best public face in local government when it comes to moving something like a community AD campaign, because of past relationships that may have been burned in different political advocacy campaigns in the past, right? And also because one thing to keep in mind when, if you're interested in pushing a community AD campaign in your locality, is that this in no shape or form needs to be a controversial issue, right? It is common sense policy to have to give people form of identification in your community. It's just literally not only makes their lives easier, and it's humane to do, but also is easier in terms of like the local government and its bureaucracies and agencies, right? It's a net positive for everyone. So there's no need to politicize, partisanize the campaign. And that's where somebody like Josie Bacalao, who is the lead at Hispanic Unity, one of the most prominent organizations in Broward County. They're advocacy, but largely a service provider organization. And you really have to identify, again, an organization like that is non-political in a lot of regards, non-partisan, non-controversial, has a good reputation, has good relationships with the commission to basically, if not be the face, be a strong partner in the advocacy process. Because, to be fair to local government and the commissioners who you will be talking to, you're not asking them to do a small task here. You're asking them to implement a community ID that's going to benefit, possibly thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the case of Broward and Miami-Dade County. And, there's a lot of liabilities and possibilities for it to go wrong. So you need somebody that's going to be trusted and professional and has a track record of successful community implementation of programs. So again, it's just really, really important that you identify those community partners that are trusted, that have a track record of being successful and professional to partner with if you're going to be successful.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tomas. And now we're transitioning to our next section, lobbying, critical for getting it done. We're going to discuss meetings, getting a sponsor, and continuing engagement. Meetings, you need a plan. It is so critical to map out strategy in order to ensure that you will build out a successful campaign. Start with your allies. For example, in Broward, obviously it was Commissioner Holness, starting there, right? In Miami-Dade, we knew Daniela Levine Cava had been a sponsor of this. And Aileen Higgins became the new sponsor. So having early meetings with allies who will help advocate in this mission. Setting up meetings, it's probably going to take more than one ask. And that's okay. Send an email. You might not get a response. In fact, you probably won't get a response. Send another email, make a phone call. Persistence is critical to ensure that you get your time to make your argument and sell this program for what it is. It is critical for our entire community. We need to implement it now. On that, building your talking points. Make sure you have persuasive talking points that are both applicable to the community and appeal to each specific elected official. And by working in coalition, you can identify those talking points and who can message what. Tomas, can you talk to us about the importance of identifying a champion and a sponsor?
Yeah. So I'll start out by a champion, right? I already sort of touched on it previously, but you really have to identify somebody that's going to be a forceful advocate within the lawmaking body. In this case, it's going to be a city council or county or commission, right? You really need someone that's going to be passionate about this, that understands the implications and benefits for the community, and that it's going to make a forceful argument for them, while also having like the relationships in the dais or the lawmaking body to get it through, right? And we were extremely blessed and lucky to work again with Commissioner Dale Holness in Broward County, who we got in partnership with him, and largely through a lot of his efforts and political maneuvering, we got a unanimous vote of approval in Broward County. And in Miami-Dade County, again, we were blessed to work with Commissioner Eileen Higgins, who, it's a larger body over in Miami-Dade County. It's 13 commissioners. And we were able to get a 12-1, only one commissioner voting no on the initiative, which is, for you that follow Miami-Dade County politics, I know the ideological makeup of that commission. It was no small feat to get that level of approval for the program. So it really speaks volumes, not just for the advocates, of course, and all the people that worked in it, but also for the commissioners that really, and their staff that put so much time and effort into having this be successful, right? And are still working, to get us money, funding, and implementing these programs as we move forward. Now, in terms of identifying a sponsor, this kind of ties into what I was talking about earlier, in partnering with a community organization, to push through the ID that's, has a good track record and reputation within that community. Again, this program, the Faith Action ID model of community IDs, it's not the Miami-Dade County or Broward issuing the IDs themselves. It's them recognizing the set of standards for community ID within the Faith Action ID program and partnering with a community organization that's actually going to be responsible for the implementation, distribution, and record keeping of these IDs moving forward, right? And the reason why we did this is because in Florida, we have to be careful about people's public records, right? We have a law, SB 168, at the state level, that mandates that a certain level of compliance when it comes to immigration enforcement agencies having access to, state agency information in regards to, again, immigration enforcement. So we have to make sure that we're protecting the applicants of these IDs, the recipients of these IDs. So partnering with a community organization, they are shielded to some degree from a public records request or subpoenas when it comes to this information, right, about the ID recipients. They're not shielded fully. And if the federal government, these immigration enforcement agencies ultimately want this information, they can get it. But Florida statute also determines that only basically the proof of age is mandated to be held by this third-party organization that would ultimately be responsible for the ID program. So that also makes the list not very useful in terms of a target list for immigration enforcement purposes. So, in terms of what you're looking for, in terms of a sponsoring organization, again, you're looking for an organization that's non-political, obviously non-partisan, non-controversial, has some, at least some, legal experience or legal know-how, lawyers on staff, preferably, a track record of, service programs, right? Like a service provider, and somebody that's not going to attract heat from partisan sides of the aisle. I'll pass it back to you, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks, Tomas. And now continuing engagement. So like we were talking before with meetings, you're going to have to be persistent. The persistence continues after you get that first meeting. Use your connections to think who has sway for which commissioner, who can make a phone call and see where they are, which group can confirm that they will vote yes for this resolution. And then also use those allies to get intel on what are the concerns, what might be preventing one commissioner from voting yes, and then do everything in your power to mitigate that concern. It's also critical to consider letters of support. For this, for the community ID effort, we got letters of support from law enforcement, from the school board, from hospital systems, from providers who work with those experiencing homelessness, the elderly, those who work with youth, those who work in health. At a certain point, if your support is so broad, it becomes extremely difficult for any elected official to try to combat the value of this, because odds are that one of these sectors will appeal to them. I want to quickly honor and shout out the first wins that occurred in Florida. We would be remiss to not acknowledge the fact that the wins in Miami-Dade and Broward were at least partially attributable to the wins that occurred before us. Thank you, Alachua County. Thank you, West Palm Beach. In Alachua, shout out to the brave Mavericks there. They established the first Faith Action Community ID program in the state, starting in the city of Gainesville, and after that successful implementation, expanding to the entire county. Their priorities were based on directly impacted individuals through an organization called Madres Sin Fronteras, and through organizations like the Human Rights Coalition, the Westminster Presbyterian Church, Florida Legal Services, and so many others. They were able to have 2 wins in Alachua, their first city and county win. West Palm shortly followed. And what's important to highlight here is the modification. When they came up with so many hurdles to win at the county level, they decided to fight at the city level and to win. And despite the fact that they're limited to just the city of West Palm Beach and the city of Belglade, they have found by implementing these programs through the Legal Aid Society of Palm Beach that the entire county is benefiting. Modify your strategy to give your community the benefits they need. And in closing, there are so many more policy fights to come. We have set and release policies, right? Which could mitigate the impact of destructive laws like SB 168, Tomas mentioned. It's codified in the Florida statutes as Section 908. A set and release policy would eliminate some of the discretion that law enforcement has to arrest individuals and significantly hinder the deportation machine. Also, in the spirit of coalitions, take up local policy fights with each other. We all must continue supporting each other in order to win for all of us. And Tomas, do you have any closing words?
I'll just say, again, shout out to the folks from Alachua, the folks from Palm Beach. We were definitely sending them like a barrage of like emails throughout the whole campaign, asking them questions and, just like really leaning on them. So definitely, their like expertise and previous experience was instrumental and required for us to do this. So big shout out to them and everybody else involved in this.
Yep, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that's a great time for us to offer, right? Just like we relied so heavily on our partners, we welcome you to rely on us as your partners, as you build out your own community ID campaign. I'm dropping my email in the chat. Tomas, if you can drop your email as well. And Commissioner Holness, I notice you're still on. Do you have any parting words for our viewers?
Let me just thank all of you for your leadership role in this effort. It takes all of us to build a better community and a better nation. The more of us that participate in this process, the better it is for all of us. America is certainly a great country, but we still have to work to make it even better than it is. That's what it takes. all of us working together. And I thank you for allowing me to be a part of this effort to build a better place for every person. Thank you.
And thank you again so much, Commissioner, for your leadership and for joining us despite having your mother in the emergency room.
Okay, thank you.
And we look forward to having more community IDs in Florida. Have a great day.
We look forward, just one thing. We know that TPS has been extended for the Haitian people here in Broward in the United States. And I'm planning to work with the Haitian Lawyers Association amongst other community organizations to help with that TPS process. And maybe we can build in the ID program around what we do with that, because certainly those folks would need some identification until they're able to get their paperwork qualifying them for TPS. So we'll have some further conversation with that and to see how we do. We're thinking now of possibly the first weekend in August. Today we had a citizenship drive, and we're either going to build it into our next citizenship drive next month or the first weekend in August to make that happen. I anticipate there'll be a large number of people that will need our help.
Thank you so much. Really, really proud of all the work that's been happening in the state of Florida, and for leaders like all of you, while waiting with your mom in the hospital, joining us. I'm so inspired by this leadership. Tomas, Oliver, learning a lot from your work, and hopefully we will transfer it all over the Florida. Now, actually, we're going to take a little break to have the last hour panel where we're going to talk about the policy and next steps. So hopefully you can take some break, and we will see you again in the last live.